All right, welcome to 2025. This is my first sermon of 2025. Joe filled in admirably last week with a sermon he's been working on for over a year. Did Joe not do a great job starting us off for the year? Some of you are clapping. You're like, I wasn't here last week. I'm not sure, but sure, everyone else is, so I might as well clap too. Now, I titled this one A Fresh Start because this is the first sermon also where I'm speaking as part of a new non-denominational church. Many of you who have been with us for the past year know we've been on a bit of a journey over the past year. And I, for one, I'm immensely grateful and thankful for the journey that I've personally been on with the denomination that I grew up with from here. I think actually the church that I used to go to, I was the first kid that was baptized by the pastor of this church. And so it's a denomination that I've known my entire life, 40 plus years, and it feels weird, different, new to be in this space, but it feels right. And for me, this is like a fresh start. Maybe for some of you, it kind of feels the same, but I thought what I would do is I would begin the year with a sermon series called There and Back Again, subtitled An Awaken Tale. And last week, some of you knew exactly where this title came from. Elle was like, hey, can you make The Hobbit required watching for this sermon series? So, thank you to Elle. The Hobbit is now required reading or watching for this sermon series. And I think this title, I have been fascinated by this phrase for many, many years. There and back again, because for me, this encapsulates the journey of life. And there's a particular quote in The Hobbit that so before the movies came out, I don't know how long ago those movies came out, the trilogy, that they really extended into a trilogy, I guess we could say. I wanted to reread the book. I had read it when I was much younger, but I wanted to reread it before I watched the films. And upon rereading, there were a few quotes in there that I was like, wow, these are profound, filled with so much wisdom. And I want to share with you one of those quotes this morning. We talked about from The Hobbit, but one of these quotes that it's just stayed with me now for, 10 years. I don't know when those movies came out, but it's probably been about 10 years. When I read this, it was like, oh, wow, this is it. This has so much wisdom here. And I would suggest that this sermon series is totally based on this quote right here, as well as a few other things that I've been learning over the years. And so when we get to the end of The Hobbit, we get to the end of this massive journey that Bilbo has taken. We read this. It was on May the 1st that the two, speaking about Bilbo and, who knows, his traveling companion, Gandalf, because Gandalf the wizard has been traveling with Bilbo on his way back to the Shire. So the two came back at last. Bilbo has been on this journey. Gandalf the wizard has taken him on this crazy expedition, but now it's over. And Bilbo is returning home. So they came at last to the brink of the valley of Rivendell, where stood the last or the first homely house. On his way out of the Shire, it was the last house. When he was leaving home, it was the last house he saw, the place that felt safe and secure. And now on his return home, well, it's no longer the last home, it is the first home he sees as he returns back to the place where he grew up. Now, I have a map for us, a map of Middle Earth, in case you're not familiar with Middle Earth. And as we see here, I'm going to use my little laser that I just learned I had after like 8 years of having this thing. I learned a year ago that there was actually a laser on it. So as we see here, this is the last homely house here in Rivendell. And do we see what's right here? The Misty Mountains. Now, let's expand the map a little bit so we have a bigger idea of where we are. Here's Rivendell, where the last or the first homely house is. Here's the Misty Mountains. And where is the Shire? Over here. Hobbits stayed on this side of the mountains. Bilbo might have been the first to cross over from the safe, secure, known, familiar into the land that is unfamiliar, unknown, a land of dangers. Now here he is returning home. He crosses back over the misty mountains after he's taken this journey, and he sees that which he is familiar with, but it's no longer the last home, it's now the first home, because his entire perspective has shifted. He has had these experiences that have changed him. The journey, and this happens subconsciously, often we're not aware of it, but the journey, and we're all on a journey. We all have these unknown experiences, unknown at the time. We don't know what we're walking into. That's why I love it. We talk about, in our culture, when we talk about moving forward into the future, we talk about embracing that which is before us. Where we have this vision, we can look out and our past is behind us. In the ancient world, I remember learning this in Hebrew 101. I was like, ooh, this is good too. These like all the little nuggets that you kind of pack away, you tuck away in the back of your mind. In the ancient Near East, instead of walking forward into your future, people would walk backward. Because you know what your past, you can see your past. You know where you've been, what you've been through, but the future is an unknown. So in the ancient world, people would walk backwards into the future because they had no idea what was ahead of them. The journey that you're on, that which will happen in the next couple of days, weeks, months, years, it will change you. And it's supposed to change you. That's what life is all about. It's all about growth and growing and expanding and being challenged, but then embracing the challenge that's before you. And so that journey changes you because you're leaving that which is known, that which is familiar. We never grow when we are in the comfortable, known, familiar places. The times in which we are changed the most is when we embrace the uncertainty and that which is not familiar. It's when we cross over from the misty mountains into the land that no one knows what is over there. Now there's this phrase, another phrase that I have swimming in my mind. I've had this one probably 15 years now. I remember exactly where I was when I heard this phrase. I was living at 1 Sterling Road. We rented this house, me and Steph, for a year. I was cleaning the bedroom listening to a podcast, and the podcaster was talking about this particular phrase for like 30, 45 minutes. And this has stayed with... You ever have something like that where something comes into your mind, you hear about something, you learn about something, there's a quote, and you can pinpoint exactly where you were when you heard that quote for the first time? Or someone gives you news, and the news is really good news, or it's really traumatic news. And you know exactly where you were when the news came through to you. For me, this is one of those phrases. You can't step in the same river twice. I love it. I have a video for us here. After the ad, of course, because YouTube now has to capitalize on every single video that they have. How do we skip this? Hours of a river. If you have trouble sleeping at night, just Google running river on YouTube. You have 10 hours of it. It will help you sleep. Sound now. You can't step into the same river twice. Here's a river. What's happening to the water in the river? It's flowing. It's dynamic. It's moving. It's not static. It's not staying still. You can visit this same exact geographic location. You can be here one day. You could walk across the small little river. You could come back 2 weeks later. You could come back 2 hours later, and the river has changed. Yeah, it's the same river, but the water is different. You can't step into the same river twice because you are changing. The river is changing, you're growing, you have these new and different and unique experiences, and somehow, in some way, they're doing something to you, and you are being changed. Oftentimes you aren't aware of the change that is taking place. Sometimes you can look back on your life. Remember, I love this vision right here where we're walking backward into the future because you're looking back on your past, which Joe talked about last week, reflecting on where we've been. Then you can pinpoint the moments of change, what has led you to where you currently are. But if you're just going through life and you look, it's become the new normal for you. Now, at Awaken, this thing wants us to watch all 10 hours of the video. Oh man, look at that. There we go. At Awaken, our vision is to create followers of Jesus. And here's how it all begins. 2,000 years ago, Matthew chapter 4. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers. Simon called Peter, his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said. I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and they followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were also in a boat, fishing, with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father, and they followed him. Question for us: what did these men have to do in order to follow Jesus? Answer: cross the misty mountains. They had to leave home. They had to leave all that was known and familiar and comfortable. They were part of the family business. Chances are they had been fishing with their father their entire lives. This is what they expected to do with their entire lives. They were fishermen. That was their identity. That's who they were. That's how they always thought they were going to be known. Jesus comes along, this unknown rabbi at the time, and he says, hey, follow me. Get out of your boat. Leave your father. Leave your household. Leave your identity behind and come follow me. And essentially, let's see what happens. I mean, that's basically how you could translate it. Follow me and let's go and see what happens. And as these men, these disciples followed Jesus, their lives were changed. Their lives were transformed. They had their eyes open to new perspectives, because that's how it works. You leave home, you leave the Shire, and all of a sudden, you now begin to see things differently. You meet different people. You come across new ideas. Your perspective begins to shift, which means then that their understanding of themselves, their understanding of God and religion changed as well. And they then began embodying new ways of living. They started as fishermen. Then they began following Jesus. Their lives expanded. And eventually, these disciples, these men who Jesus like, get out of your boat, come and follow me, well, they then carried on the message, the way of Jesus, after his death. And because of their willingness to leave home, their willingness to cross the misty mountains, this way of Jesus is now the tradition or the way of life that we 2,000 years later have inherited. And it all started because they were willing to step out and risk, to leave behind that which they were familiar with. Transformation happens, as it happened for these disciples. Transformation happened by following a person. For them, their transformation occurred because they were willing to follow Jesus, follow his path, follow his way of being. And they were open. Now, if you know the story of the disciples, you know they had quite a few stumbles along the way. Even as Jesus was going to the cross, they still didn't quite get it. It really wasn't until after the resurrection that they finally fully grasped and understood what Jesus was all about. Because even after his death, they all were they were unsure of where to take things. But then after Jesus reappeared to them, then they finally got it and began carrying forward this message. For Awaken, our starting vision is to create followers of Jesus. Now, this was Vision 2.0 because we actually had an earlier vision before we came up with this one. Now, when I came up with this vision of create followers of Jesus, probably, maybe like 8 years ago, 7 years ago. I think it was right when Reese was born, so 7 or 8 years ago. Here was a realization that I had. Now, this is rocket science 101. The realization was, if Awaken's vision is going to be about creating followers of Jesus, that meant that I had to be a follower of Jesus. I know, brilliant, right? Like mind-blowing, isn't it? So if we're talking about, the thing that we're doing here on Sunday mornings at the Bible study community group, everything that we do here at Awaken, if it's all about creating followers of Jesus, I realized in order to lead, as the pastor of this church, in order to lead Awaken on that path, well, then I had to be an active follower of Jesus myself. I mean, this is how it's been for me from the very beginning of Awaken and even obviously before Awaken. For me, following Jesus, it's not this static path where you come across some ideas and then those ideas continue to carry you. For me, it's always been this active process of learning, of growing, of continuing to have encounters with the resurrected Christ, because that's my prayer, that's my desire for all of you as well. I don't think you meet the resurrected Christ and then boom, that's it. No, but there's constant encounters where you keep growing and following Jesus. There's always another step to take. There's always another mountain to cross over. You come to you're in the Shire, you cross the mountains, well then the place where you are then becomes the new Shire. And so you have to cross the mountains again, and then that becomes the new Shire. Then you have to cross the mountains again. For me, that's what following Jesus is all about. Following Jesus into the places that can be uncomfortable at times. Sometimes you're challenged, but all for the purpose of growing and going deeper in your walk, going deeper in your faith, of understanding who Jesus is, who you are, and what God desires for your life. That's my belief, is that's why you're all here Sunday after Sunday, because you want to know what the next step is. You want to know where Jesus is leading you next. You're okay with where you are, but you also want to move into the next step, the next place that God has for you. Now, I mentioned we had an earlier vision of Awaken. So the first vision of Awaken, like 15 or so years ago. Actually, I was doing the math earlier this week when I was thinking about this transition. 20 years of full-time ministry last year. It's like incredible. I'm at 21. It's like, how in the world did that ever happen? 20 years already? My goodness. Now, but it's been a joy, and I love it, and I can't wait to see what's next. Now, the first vision of Awaken, it was to grow an awareness of God's presence. And what's really interesting for me, since I started Awaken, what's interesting is to see how Awaken has evolved. It's how I've been growing as well. And so it's interesting to look back on this vision that I crafted 15 years ago, and then look back and be like, oh, wow, that's where I was 15 years ago. I love it. Because for me, I mean, this is still very, very important, because I believe God's presence is all around us all the time. Hence the name Awaken, because I want to awaken our eyes to where God is present in this moment. Think about Moses. Well, the ground I'm standing on, it's holy ground. Is it only holy ground because he recognized that it was holy, or was it always holy ground? And now Moses all of a sudden realized, God's always been here in this place, and his eyes just needed to be opened. He needed to be awakened to that reality. So the first vision was growing in awareness of God's presence. And we said we did this 4 ways when we first started Awaken. Number 1, ongoing exploration. And this has always been a value that I strongly, strongly believe in. And it became ever clear to me probably about 2 weeks ago when I was in the car with my daughter driving home from ballet, and her favorite song she asked to listen to. And when I heard this one particular lyric, it unlocked this entire sermon for me, and it unlocked the past 20 years of my life. And it came from Taylor Swift. Who knows the song Welcome to New York? Yes, every time we're driving in the car, if she gets bored with the radio or whatever song's playing, she's like, can we please put on Welcome to New York? I'm like, all right, for the 52nd time, sure, we can do it. Actually, it's probably more than 52 times. And I'm listening to this song, and I've heard this song so many times. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this one. But for some reason, this one particular lyric jumped out at me this time listening to it. And it's this phrase, like any real love, it's ever changing. Now, as I was in the car with her, philosophically thinking about this line, so at first we were listening to it together, and then I went off in my own place while she was just rocking out to the song in the back seat of the car. I started thinking about this advice that I heard from a marriage therapist, again, something else that I tucked away in the back of my mind a very, very long time ago. And what this marriage therapist said is she recommended annually renewing your wedding vows. And I found this as a very odd piece of advice when I first heard this. Like, whoa, okay, I know people sometimes renew them 10 years, 25, 50 years, you go and renew them. But every single year, that seems a bit excessive, does it not? Like, do you really need to have those reminders every year? Like, okay, I need to commit to this person again? Like, is it really that shallow of a relationship? But then I heard her talk about it, and I was struck by the wisdom behind this advice. And the wisdom that she offered about why she suggested to do this is because you are constantly evolving. You are constantly changing. You're growing, and so is your spouse. So the person that you married however many years ago, well, it's the same person, but it's a different person. You know what I mean? You ever experienced this? And the person that you were when you got married, well, you're the same, but you're different. Because you've had your unique experiences. The times in which you've grown, you've been challenged, you've crossed the mountains. And so every year, she suggested that you recommit to the person that your spouse is at that moment and the person that you are in this moment. Now, I haven't taken this advice, but I always do think about this quite a bit because I realize, well, I'm different and Steph is different. And the hope, obviously the prayer is that you grow together, but you recommit because you realize that you're constantly changing and your experiences, they're continually changing how you see yourself, how you see others, how you see God, and how you see religion. Here's another way to look at this. God's love for you, all from Taylor Swift, of course, right? God's love for you stays the same, but the expression of that love can look different. And here's what I mean by that. I have 2 kids. They're 8 and 5. The way in which I love my kids when they were newborn, well, it's different than the expression of love I have for them now. I love them just as much. Actually, I would argue that my love for them has grown. Because at first, I'm like, who is this person interrupting my sleep? I used to be able to sleep through the night, and then, oh my goodness, right? So at first, you're like, do I really want to have this person around? Well, then you grow, and your love begins to expand. But the way in which I parent, the way in which I express that love, well, there's sometimes I need to be more nurturing. There's sometimes I need to be challenging. There's sometimes you need to just sit in the car and listen to Taylor Swift together. And then there's other times you need to sit in silence or you need to have a difficult conversation. I would argue that God's love for you is boundless. It's always been that way. But the expression, how God expresses that love, well, there's some seasons of life when you need a little more comfort. You've all been there. You know those moments when you're crying out to God, God, I need your presence now more than I needed it before because what I'm going through, it's so difficult. Maybe you prayed that prayer for someone before. You've asked for God to bring comfort, peace, healing to their lives. But then there's moments when you need a little nudge. You've been on the couch too long. You've been hanging out in the Shire too long. And so Gandalf comes along and gives you that little nudge to cross the mountain. So God's love for you, it's ever eternally boundless and for you and with you. The expression, how God expresses that, sometimes it changes season to season. Have you ever had a moment in life where you've been going through particular disciplines, where you've been reading your Bible in a certain way, you've been praying a certain way, and you just kind of hit a rut? And you realize that what you've been doing, how you've been connecting with God, it's not working for you any longer. And so you need to change it up a bit. So you incorporate a prayer walk. You go in the woods, silence, solitude, just listening to God. Maybe you go through a season where every morning you wake up and instead of opening your Bible, you wake up in silence for 5 minutes. And you have a journal and you just listen to what the Spirit is speaking. So any true love, it's ever changing. It stays the same. It's boundless. It's there. But the expression of that love can change from season to season. Think about the disciples. When Jesus first called them, Jesus had great love for them. He saw their potential. Who the disciples were in the beginning of their journey with Jesus, completely different. We heard about the call of Peter. Or about the call, Peter. Well, who Peter was in the beginning when he was fishing with his father, very, very different than the Peter that we find when he's writing epistles later on in the New Testament, because he's had these moments, these experiences, these encounters. It's changed him. It's grown him deeper in his understanding of who God is and how to lead others on that journey. Now, I was thinking all about this, I guess on that 15-minute ride home back from ballet. I had all this swirling around in my mind. And obviously, I've been thinking quite a bit about this transition that I've been going through from a denomination to now non-denominational. And it's been a personal journey, because this is something that's been a part of me for so long. And then as conversations started to happen last year, I began to realize, okay, I have left home. I have walked away from that which is familiar and known, and I've changed. I'm a different person, and again, you can't necessarily pinpoint those moments, but looking back, I realize, okay, where I was, the things that I held to be so true before, well, now my perspective has shifted, and I see things a little bit different because of my experiences and what I've been through. And I'll give you one example, because this is something for me that has completely transformed my view of God. And it's the difference between beginning the story of Scripture in Genesis 3 or beginning it in Genesis 1. Because where you start the story of God makes a whole world of difference. Now, to some people, that difference is unseen. But I would argue that where you begin the story of God's relationship with humanity, with us, it matters. It deeply, deeply matters. And if you want to explore this a little more, this book has been amazing. It's called Original Blessing by Danielle Schroyer. Genesis 3, if you begin the story of God's relationship with humanity in Genesis 3, you come to the fall, that which is known as the fall, eating of the forbidden fruit. And Genesis 3 talks about sin. It talks about our brokenness. It talks about separation from God. And of course, sin is part of the story. We've all experienced brokenness in our own lives. We see it in our own lives. We see it in the world. I don't think there's anyone that would argue and say, well, brokenness isn't a part of the story, because we've experienced it ourselves. Genesis 1, though, it begins where everything is in harmony. All things are in their proper place. There's a blessing that God is pronouncing over creation. We have a picture of wholeness. And then we have this, call it a chorus that's on repeat all through Genesis 1. It was good. It was good. It was good. God creates. It was good. God creates. It was good. It keeps going and going and going. In Genesis 1, we find this. God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, God created them. Male and female, he created them. And then what did God do once humanity's been created? God blessed them. Be fruitful and increase in number. If you begin the story of the Bible, God's relationship with humanity in Genesis 3, you are a problem that then needs to be fixed. which means that you are then fundamentally flawed as a person. But if you begin the story of God's relationship with humanity in Genesis 1, what you come to discover is that you, me, all of us, well, you're someone who is deeply loved. You're fundamentally good. God has blessed you. Your story begins with a word of blessing over you. And then Genesis 3 enters the picture, but that now tells us that you're loved and you're an individual who's now in need of healing. And aren't we all? Don't we all have pain and brokenness within us that's in need of God's healing, of God's saving, God's power to come and restore that which has been broken or lost? If we begin the story in Genesis 3, and many systems, religious systems, will begin the story in Genesis 3. I was a part of a system that began the story in Genesis 3. I would speak to pastors whose view of God and God's relationship with us and how God views us begins in Genesis 3. And here's how it goes. After speaking to a pastor about his sermon, visiting pastor at Awaken, I asked him, what was that? His response was, when people leave a sermon, my hope is that they feel beaten up. Why? Well, because God needs them to be beaten up so that they'll change. Really? Wow. Okay. Can't get behind that one. For me, the purpose of a sermon is to remind each and every one of you how much you're loved. Because for me, the only thing that transforms and changes, what I've experienced, what I've seen in others, it's love. It's love. And if there's one thing I would want to leave each of you with every single Sunday when you walk out the doors, it's a reminder of how much you're loved by God and how big God's grace is for you and how God's mercy is ever upon you. And that if you ever feel like you've blown it, that there's forgiveness and second chances. And that Jesus has come, God in the flesh has come to this world to bring healing to your life. Not to condemn, but to bring wholeness to the places where you need wholeness. So for me, over the past 20 years, I realized, wow, my view of the Bible, it's subtle, but it's not so subtle when you think about it. Because where you begin the story matters. I read this a couple of weeks ago. I mentioned this book back at Christmas, How God Changes Your Brain. And for me, this ongoing exploration, I'm always learning and growing, and I want to know more. I want to learn more about how we're wired and who we are. And I read this. Envision an authoritarian or critical entity, be it another person or God, will activate the limbic areas of the brain that generate fear and anger. Thus, the brain is primed to fight. However, that's Genesis 3 right there. So when you envision God in this way, that you're fundamentally flawed, well, now your brain is primed to fight. It's activating a particular part of your brain. However, when you perceive God as a benevolent force, a different part of the brain is stimulated in the prefrontal cortex. When stimulated, it suppresses the impulse to get angry or frightened. It also helps generate feelings of empathy toward others who are suffering or hurt. What's one of the most common commands in the Bible? Fear not. Don't be afraid. Think about this. When God is critical of you, how is that living into this? When your view of God is this powerful entity who is out to get you and who's critical of all your flaws and all the ways in which you have blown it and haven't measured up, it's activating a part of your brain that is creating fear and anxiety within you. Would God wire us this way? But when you view God as someone who is for you, with you, someone who loves you, someone who desires your healing. Now this begins to make sense. Psalm 119. Oh, how I love your law. Speaking about the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis included here. I meditate on it all day long. Your view of God changes you. It can activate particular parts of your brain, which can create fear or it can suppress fear. I choose to begin the story in Genesis 1. A story that says, at your heart, at the heart of who you are good. And you are blessed. Sure, maybe you've gone on a wrong path. Maybe you've fallen off from here or there. But that's not who you are. Your true identity is someone who is deeply loved. And Jesus comes to restore that which has been lost within you. For us at Awaken, our vision, create followers of Jesus, the new Vision 2.0, the first way we do it, by welcoming others into God's love. Because love is at the heart of all we do. And when we focus on a God of love, a God who is for us, it transforms us, and it also changes how we view others. So for Awaken, this is a place of love, where we express love for every single person who comes through the door. The point of a sermon isn't to beat you all up so that when you leave here on a Sunday, you feel like you've just gone 9 rounds in the boxing ring. But rather, the purpose of a sermon, the purpose of church, is that you would feel good. And that you would feel valued and filled with worth and love. Because fundamentally, that's who you are. And that's how God views you. So as we begin this year, I want to begin with communion. Eucharist, the good gift of Christ that shows the boundless, eternal love of God that is ever for you. That God will cross the misty mountains, go to whatever length God has to go to in order to bring healing and wholeness to your life because you're worth it. And that's how God views you.